Post 352, Study Session 8, Politics in Nigeria. Introduction. In this study session, we will direct our searchlight on Nigeria as a single case to use in understanding the many issues confronting other African states. We will look at Nigeria's size, the constant struggle in Nigeria between authoritarian and democratic forces, among others. We will also present an account of how institutions of governance function in Nigeria historically, and how they operate in practice, given the vagaries of military domination in Nigeria's political processes. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to know that Nigeria is an important and influential country in Africa. Explain the issues involved in Nigeria's perennial struggle between authoritarian and democratic forces. Present how institutions of governance function in Nigeria. And lastly, highlight the vagaries of military involvement in Nigeria's political system. Nigeria at crossroads. It used to be argued, as Nigeria goes, so goes the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. The pithy statement, often repeated in both policy and academic circles, reflects at least three positions of interest to this lecture, and sheds light on why Africa, and Nigeria in particular, warrant studies. Nigeria therefore provides a crucible in which to examine questions of democracy and authoritarianism, the pressures and management of ethnic conflicts, and economic underdevelopment brought about by both colonial oppression and independent Nigeria's mismanagement of its vast resources. Each of these issues contributes important lessons for understanding the themes of this book, The Democratic Idea, collective identities, political economy, and the world of states, particularly as they relate to the developing world. As a single case to use in studying the many issues confronting other African states, as well as many developing states in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, Nigeria commends itself for careful analysis. The first concerns Nigeria's size. With a population of almost 150 million, Nigeria is by far the largest country in Africa and among the 10 most populous countries in the world. About 1 out of every 5 black Africans is Nigerian. The second reason to study Nigeria is that unlike most other countries on the continent, Nigeria has a salutary combination of human and material resources to help it overcome the vicious cycle of poverty and autocracy that has become all too prevalent in Africa. Anticipating this breakthrough for the last 35 years of independence has been a source of considerable pessimism, some deserved and some not, for Nigeria as well as for all of Africa. If Nigeria, with its vast resources, cannot succeed in breaking this cycle, what does that portend for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa? A third reason to study Nigeria is that it is a paradox. Nigeria offers within a single case both the negative and positive characteristics that identify Africa. These opposing themes are symbolized by the constant struggle in Nigeria between authoritarian and democratic forces, the push for development and the pull of underdevelopment, the burden of public corruption, and the pressure for accountability. The paradox is also symbolized by the many attempts to fashion some order out of social incoherence through the creation of a viable nation-state. There are over 250 competing nationalities or ethnic groups in Nigeria, largely defined by language differences, which repeatedly clash over economic and political resources. All these factors combine to produce the political entity known as Nigeria, with a very low level of popular legitimacy and accountability, and an increasing inability to meet the most basic of its citizens' needs. Much about Nigeria is controversial. Since gaining independence from British colonial rule in 1960, Nigeria has undergone several political transitions, from democratic governments to autocratic regimes, both military and civilian, and from one military regime to another. Against this background, Nigeria today remains essentially an unfinished state characterized by instabilities and uncertainties. Thomas Hodgkin, a highly regarded scholar of Nigerian history, once exclaimed in frustration that it was difficult to present a coherent picture of the Nigerian past. One can add that the present is even more confounding and the future very uncertain. Nevertheless, Nigerian politics has reached a critical turning point. What is not clear is in which direction the country is moving towards: an increasingly authoritarian future and greater underdevelopment, or towards the promise of democracy and sustainable growth. Nigeria remains a country characterized by ambiguity. Historical context. An examination of Nigeria's past reveals much about its development thus far and provides important clues about its future. Nigeria was a British colony from 1914 until its independence on October 1, 1960. Although foreign domination of much of the territory had actually begun in the mid-19th century, during that period, Nigeria's resources were extracted and its people exploited as cheap labor. To further the growth of British society and defray administrative costs of the British Empire. To be sure, some Nigerians benefited from British occupation. Some became wealthy and gained appointments to political positions within the colonial structure. For most Nigerians, however, colonialism left a bitter legacy. Colonialism left its imprint on all aspects of Nigeria's existence. It bequeathed a British political system that was inappropriate in many respects. It empowered certain individuals and groups and weakened others. It left a heritage of harsh authoritarian domination that instilled the idea that there were two sets of rules, one for political leaders and another for the citizenry. British domination left conflicting signals about the democratic idea. On one hand was the legacy of formerly democratic institutions, on the other hand an authoritarian political culture. Colonialism also contributed to strengthening the collective identities of Nigeria's multiple ethnic groups and fostered enduring competition among them. Most of this competition has occurred between three largest groups: the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo. Within the world of states, Nigeria has been a second-class nation, first as the victim of domination by a far stronger, more developed state, and today as a country with a weakening economy. However, it is important to emphasize that although colonialism bears much of the blame for the initial retardation of the country's political and social and economic development, Nigerians have not reversed that legacy after 3.5 decades of independent rule. Thus, Nigeria's predicament cannot be blamed exclusively on colonialism. The country's economic and political potential has been squandered by corrupt and self-seeking leadership and its poor policy decisions. Sadly, many of Nigeria's post-independence leaders have been personally more exploitative of the populace than their colonial predecessors. Most of these governments have been run by generals who have come to power via military coups and have ruled the country for all but few years since 1960. Nigeria at the crossroads of democratic ideal. Owing as much to the peculiarities of Nigerian politics as to the precariousness of military governments, Nigerian military leaders, despite their extensive control over the organs of the state and economy, are nevertheless influenced by and to a certain degree susceptible to popular opinion. Military heads of state who have not promised to return power to civilians have seen their tenures cut short by a palace coup. General Yakubu Gowon, who was the head of state from 1967 until 1975, wavered in his commitment to restore democracy and was deposed by a coup, not unlike the one that swept him to office. Gowon's successor, First General Murtala Mohammed, who was assassinated in February 1976, and his successor, General Olusegun Obasanjo, immediately pledged to initiate a transition to civilian rule. a vow honored in 1979, Nigeria's only case of the promise fulfilled. Similarly, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, who ousted the civilian government of the Second Republic between 1979 and 1983, refused to pledge a rapid return to democratic rule. His popular support consequently wavered, and Major General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida seized power. It should therefore come as no surprise that Babangida announced a program of transition to democratic rule as one of his first acts as the new head of state. Through an elaborate set of stalling techniques, the Babangida regime engaged in a deliberate effort to extend its tenure. Babangida was astute in that he did not repeat the errors of the General Gowon or Buhari before him. The promise of a civilian government was never rescinded, although it seemed increasingly distant. This so-called organized confusion involved numerous amendments, annulments, cancellations, the banning and unbanning of politicians, human rights abuses, and repeated extensions of military rule. This transition went on for 7 years until it was finally derailed in 1993. The critically important interruption of this transition process occurred when Babangida annulled the presidential election of June 12, 1993, which would have preceded a full withdrawal of the military from the political scene. Interestingly, that election had been widely acclaimed as free and fair, a notable observation that stands in stark contrast to all prior elections since independence, especially those of 1964, 1965, 1979, and 1983. Each of those elections was marred by accusations, most subsequently proven, of massive election fraud, vote rigging, and registration tampering. The annulment of June 12, 1993 election, which was apparently won by Southern businessman Moshood Abiola, provoked an angry reaction from a population weary of postponed transitions, military rule, and deception. Although the ultimate intentions of the Babangida regime may never be known, so far the Abacha regime seemed to be following the pattern set by its predecessors. General Sani Abacha seized power in November 1993 from Ernest Shonekan, whose civilian puppet government was selected and supported by Babangida. Abacha, who had held top military positions in both the Buhari and Babangida regimes, including Minister of Defense under Babangida, seized the reins of power from the timid and ineffectual Shonekan. Shonekan's government, take mate because it was literally installed in August 1993 by Babangida, was vulnerable to increasing agitation from both civilian and military ranks. As the head of state, General Abacha prolonged the now established tradition of military dominance and combined increased repression with frequent public commitments to restore a constitutional democracy. As his predecessor Babangida's program of transition to civilian. Under military rulership, political and social liberties are restricted and constitutional rights are limited or non-existent. In Nigeria, as elsewhere, one of the first acts of every military regime has been the suspension of the constitution. But Nigerians were tired of the pervasive public corruption that has hampered economic growth and threatened personal and social well-being. The effects of corruption, coupled with military rule, have been economic collapse and the revocation of political liberties. Military government has failed repeatedly to deliver on the promises made to justify seizing power. Beginning in the late 1980s, democratic transitions have swept the globe, including Africa, as populations rally against military, one-party system and dictatorial rule. Although Nigerians have been governed by military regimes for 25 or 35 years since independence, they have demonstrated a strong tradition of activism and an anti-authoritarian ethos. In times of crisis or in the face of tyranny, that activism is often manifested in negative and destructive movements against all forms of authority, including those that are apparently democratic. For example, street protests as well as university and school-based demonstrations, have all too frequently degenerated into riots and violent confrontations with the authorities. It is important to point that anti-authoritarianism does not necessarily translate into democratic political culture. It is obvious that the complex reality of Nigerian society also includes undemocratic elements. History shows that there has been a low quotient of tolerance, patience, compromise, and respect for the rule of law among political leaders and the general population. More important, the plural nature of Nigerian society could be and has been manipulated to generate social tensions that facilitate the retention of power by autocratic regimes. Indeed, Nigeria's multi-ethnic society, which has failed in many respects to achieve a truly collective identity, adds a substantial degree of complexity to its political puzzle, an aspect that will be revisited throughout this discussion. Nigeria's collective identity. Given the potential explosiveness of ethnic conflict, therefore, it is an irony of history that the Babangida regime sought to manipulate ethno-regional affairs and set different sections of the country against one another, as part of its survival strategy to resist mounting challenges to its continued stay in office, especially after June 12, 1993. Thus, a quarter century after a 30-month bloody civil war to preserve the country's unity was successfully completed, Nigeria stands divided as it has not been since 1970. The Nigerian Civil War, also referred to as the Biafran War, began in 1967 and had its origin in ethnic and regional tensions whose roots can in part be traced back to the colonial management of Nigeria's diverse ethnic populations. Chronology of major events in recent Nigerian political history. July 1966. Counter-coup led by General Yakubu Gowon with aid from northern groups. 1967. The Biafran secession. The Civil War began. 8 more states created to dilute Biafran regional support and give more power to eastern minorities. Also in 1967, the Biafran Civil War ended. July 1975. Military coup deposes Gowon, led by General Murtala Mohammed, a northerner. February 1976, Murtala Mohammed assassinated in failed coup led by Middle Belt minorities. General Olusegun Obasanjo, a Yoruba, assumes power. 1976, 7 more states created, making a total of 19 states. September 1978, new constitution completed, marking the adoption of U.S. presidential model. October 1979, elections held, a majority in both houses won by MPN, led by Northern and Hausa Fulani, Alhaji Shehu Shagari, and also elected as Nigeria's first executive president. October 1983, the MPN landslide victory marred by widespread accusations of electoral fraud. December 1983, military coup led by General Muhammadu Buhari, a northerner. August 1985, Buhari is overthrown by General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, a northerner, in a palace coup. Promises to return to democracy. In 1987, 2 new states were created, making a total of 21 states. Constituent Assembly convened to write a new constitution, while in 1988, the first round of elections were scheduled for December 1989. April 1990, an attempted coup against Babangida fails. December 1990, local government elections held. 1991, 9 new states created, making a total of 30, plus the Federal Capital Territory in Abuja. December 1991, state governor elections. NRC wins 16 states, SDP 14. State legislative elections were also held. April 1992, the new census results was released. Population figures revised downwards to 88.5 million from previous estimates of 100 million plus. July 1992, federal legislative elections held. 593 representatives, 91 senators. Turnout was 25% nationally. Senold by Babangida for alleged impropriety. September 1992, presidential primaries results were annulled by Babangida for alleged impropriety. December 1992, original date for presidential elections postponed for the third time until June 1993. March 1993, party conventions are held and party candidates for the president are elected. The NRC chooses Bashir Tofa and Hausa Fulani. The SDP selects Moshood Abiola, a Yoruba. June 12, 1993, presidential elections held. The SDP Abiola is the nominal winner. June 15, 1993, restraining order issued to prevent publication of voting results. June 23, 1993, annulment of election. August 27, 1993, original date for Babangida to leave office and cede power to civilian government. Instead, Ernest Shonekan is installed as civilian president. November 1993, General Sani Abacha seizes power in a coup. June 1994, Moshood Abiola declares himself president and is charged with treason. July 1994, a new constitutional conference convened by Abacha begins its deliberations. July to September 1994, pro-democracy strike by the major oil union, NUPENG, cuts Nigeria oil production by an estimated 25%. Sympathy strikes ensue, followed by arrest of political and civic leaders. June 1995, secret trials of former military ruler Olusegun Obasanjo and others accused of planning a coup d'etat. October 1, 1995, General Abacha announces 3-year transition civilian rule to end in 1998. Critical junctures. A number of critical junctures helped shape the character of the Nigerian state. The four identified in the section that follows illustrate the difficult path that Nigeria has taken during the past century. These junctures occurred in the pre-colonial period, in the imposition and aftermath of British colonialism, in the alternation of military and civilian rule, and in the post-1980 economic collapse precipitated internally by both Nigeria's and political corruption and over-reliance on its petroleum industry, and externally by its declining position in the world of states. State formation, the pre-colonial period. The process of state formation in Nigeria precedes the imposition of British colonial rule or any form of European influence. This was a time when the various states, peoples, and societies engaged in social and economic interactions. They included such collectivities as Kanem Borno, the Hausa states, Nupe, Igala, Oyo, Benin, the Delta states, and the Igbo communities. The interactions took various forms, including war and enslavement, diplomacy, treaties, the visit of wandering scholars, the diffusion of political and religious ideas, the borrowing of techniques, and above all, trade. One major element that shaped the course of events in the Savannah area was trade with Northern Africa across the Sahara Desert. Trade brought material benefits as well as Arabic education and Islam, which gradually replaced traditional, spiritual, political and social practices in what is now northern Nigeria. Islam's impact was so extensive that by the first few decades of the 19th century, an Islamic theocratic empire had been created through holy war jihad. In much of the territories of the northern savannah, some regions, such as the area to the south, now known as the Middle Belt, people by the Tiv, were able to repel jihadist attacks. From the time of its founding, the Fulani Empire sought to use a common religion, Islam, and a common language, Hausa, to forge a unity out of the disparate groups in that area of what later became Nigeria. The Fulani Empire held sway until British colonial rule was imposed on northern Nigeria around 1900. Much of Nigeria's pre-colonial history including the first 1,000 years AD, has had to be reconstructed from oral history because, with few exceptions, illiterate culture evolved much later. Evidence from about 1000 AD shows that the first major division between the peoples in this area was neither linguistic nor cultural, but geographic. These geographic distinctions had implications for state formation among the peoples of the forest belt to the south as compared to those of the more open savanna to the north. The more open terrain in the north, with its need for irrigation, encouraged by early growth of centralized states. Such states from the 8th century included Kano Borno in the northeast and the Hausa states in the west. The more prominent Hausa states that included walled cities were Kano, Katsina, Zauzau, also called Zaria, Rano, Dara, Gobi, and Biram. Still, another attempt at state formation led to the emergence of Jukun Kingdom. However, by the end of the 17th century, the Jukun became a tributary state of the Borno Empire, an unconsolidated Islamic state, that is a caliphate, with its center in Sokoto and headed by the Sultan of Sokoto, has also exercised religious and some political authority since the early 19th century. Towards the southern edge of the savannah live such groups as the TV, whose political organizations seldom extended beyond the village level. Within such societies, politics was generally conducted along lineage and kinship lines. Political authority was diffuse rather than centralized. Considering their loose political structures, it is not surprising that they were later described by Western contacts as stateless societies. Years later, these societies escaped much of the upheaval experienced by the centralized states and retained much of their autonomy. The development of collective identities was equally complex in the area now called southern Nigeria. This ranged from the highly centralized empires and kingdoms of Oyo and Ife, now identified with the Yoruba, and Benin in the west to the fragmentary Acephalous societies to the east, now identified with the Igbo, and the trading city-states of the Niger Delta and its hinterland. The growth of the kingdoms of Oyo, Ife and Benin is not attributable to specific external factors, as was the case with northern state formation through Islam, or in the Niger Delta through European slave trading and subsequently legitimate trade. Contact with Europeans along the coast and the hinterland generated social conflicts and tensions and provoked the subsequent loss of autonomy for these polities. External factors led to the eventual disintegration of the Oyo Empire in the early 19th century through attacks from the Dahomey Kingdom to the west, now in the neighboring country of Benin, and Islamic jihadists from the Fulani Empire to the north. The general scenario at the time colonial rule was fully imposed was, however, one in which social conflicts tended to occur more frequently within ethno-regional constituencies than between them. World trade and other interaction notwithstanding, there was considerable isolation and thus limited contact and conflict across ethno-linguistic lines. Fulani Empire, building in much of the northern Nigeria, involved a holy war on the Hausa states and other political communities from 1804 to around 1830. In the same way, following the decline of the Oyo Empire, much of the area now called Yoruba land was a scene of rivalries and warfare from the late 18th century through much of the 19th century. In the Igbo area of the east, prior to colonial rule, there was no overarching political authority and therefore little sense of a common history. The intensity of divisions within the fiercely independent Igbo communities was as strong, if not stronger, than those between them and their more hierarchically organized neighbors of the Delta. In conclusion, state formation in Nigeria predates the colonial period, although it was either blocked or diverted along a different course as a result of colonial rule. Even after the imposition of the colonial state, these pre-colonial formations continued to exercise a parallel authority over Nigerians, especially in the Hausa Fulani areas of the north and among the Yoruba. governance, and policy making. The rough edges of what has been called the unfinished Nigerian state are very much in evidence with regard to its institutions of governance and policy making. Thus, it is difficult to characterize and categorize precisely the institutions of governance in Nigeria as can be done for other countries. We begin with a discussion of Nigerian constitutions. Constitutions are intended to form the basis of the fundamental laws and principles of modern states. The Constitution establishes the legal institutional framework for the governance of the society, the role of the states, and the rights and duties of citizens. Nigeria has changed its constitution often in the search for perfection, with constant constitutional engineering and the inauguration of several constitutions since colonial amalgamation in 1914. Although much attention has been focused on making constitutions, there has been little effort made to ensure that governments govern according to the constitution and that the rule of law is enforced in place of capricious governance. In short, Nigeria has produced many constitutions, but it has yet to entrench constitutionalism. The reasons for this failure are not straightforward. Since 1914, Nigeria has inaugurated 8 constitutions, 5 under colonial rule, in 1922, 1946, 1951, 1954, and 1960, and 3 after colonial rule, the 1963 Republican Constitution, the 1979 Constitution for the Second Republic, and the 1989 Constitution for the Third Republic. The most enduring was that of the 1922 because there were few changes in the structure of colonial rule between the 2 world wars. None of the others lasted more than 6 years, and the 1989 Constitution has never gone into effect. In July 1994, Abacha convened a new constitutional conference whose decisions regarding any revisions to the 1989 document will be subject to veto by the Provisional Ruling Council. It is important to note that none of these constitutions was initiated and drafted in a genuinely democratic environment. Of the 3 prepared after independence, 2 were engineered under military rule. Only the 1963 Constitution was initiated under an elected civilian federal administration. However, that government had lost its democratic credentials and was overthrown in the coup that terminated the First Republic in January 1966. Thus, the Constitution, as a notion of democracy itself, has come to be perceived in Nigeria largely as a gift bestowed by autocratic leaders. It is not surprising, therefore, that constitutions and constitutional guarantees are among the first casualties in the aftermath of a coup against elected governments. Even under civilian rule, the tendency has been for the constitution to be treated in a cavalier manner by elected politicians who are impatient with its constraints and influenced by the authoritarian tradition of previous regimes. Governance and policy making in this context are conducted by fragile institutions that are often swamped by personal and other narrow considerations. Military rule has worked to accentuate these tendencies and to concentrate and personalize governance and policy making, restricting the space for autonomous action. Moreover, the uncertainties caused by Nigeria's deliberately mismanaged democratic transition, first under Babangida, subsequently under the Shoneko and Abacha regimes, makes it difficult to provide any definitive statements about the character of these institutions. With this in mind, we will discuss key elements of recent periods of military rule for their continued influence in the present and the institutions projected for the future under full democratic rule. Overview of the structure of the Nigerian states. Nigeria's Fourth Republic experimented with the parliamentary model in which the executive is chosen directly from the legislative ranks. The First Republic was relatively decentralized, with the locus of political power in the 3 federal units, the northern, eastern, and western regions. The constitution, which went into effect with the advent of the Second Republic in 1979, adopted a presidential model. The consensus among Nigeria's constitutional planners for the next republic is that the structure of the Nigerian polity today should resemble closely that of the United States of America. In this view, democratic Nigeria should possess a presidential system with a strong executive who is constrained by a system of checks and balances on authority, a bicameral legislature, an independent judicial branch charged with matters of law and constitutional interpretation. In addition, it should have a federal structure comprised of states and local government units, empowered to enact certain laws with their individual jurisdictions, but which are ultimately accountable to central government authority. Together, these units constitute a single national entity. In this system, the formal powers of the different levels of government would be clearly delineated and the relationships among and between them defined. In Nigeria, by contrast, these institutions have been radically altered by military rule. The dominance of central government authority, particularly the executive, has been enhanced by military rule. So while Nigerian federalism remains a subject of political and social discourse, in large part because of its ethnic overtones and federal character, it is necessary to point out that the military is not a unit of a federal governing structure, at least not in the traditional sense. The control of oil wealth by this centralized command structure has further cemented economic and political control in the center, resulting in a skewed federalism in which states enjoy nominal powers but in reality are totally dependent on the central government. Abacha's rule has weakened the constituent units still further by abolishing all elective state and local political structures. Practice of Nigerian Federation. The context in which federalism was adopted in 1954, 6 years before independence, was one in which the political elites increasingly withdrew to their ethnic constituency. Although some nationalist leaders desired a unitary republic, when the marked differences among the regions began to influence political life, it became evident that only federalism, involving units organized around major ethno-linguistic groups, offered the possibility of achieving peace and stability in a multinational country. It is important to note, however, that Nigeria actually witnessed an increase in its ethnic tension before independence. In many other African states, though ethnic tensions often did erupt following independence, the aspiring leaders were often able to put aside their ethnic differences to present a more unified front against colonial rule. In others, and Nigeria is notable among them, the prospect of a transfer of power encouraged divisive strategies that often persisted into the post-colonial era. It was widely believed that federalism, in which the constituent units agreed to subordinate their authority to a central government accorded certain powers, would be the system best suited to accommodate Nigeria's ethnic pluralism. The assumption in the 1950s, which we now know to have been overly optimistic, was that the central government would be responsible for the equitable distribution of resources to the constituent units. This arrangement is now referred to as guaranteeing unity in diversity. There are several elements of the Nigerian experience with federalism of relevance for governance and policy making. Although organized by territorial units, that is the states, around a central national government, Nigerian federalism, since inception, has operated in practice around ethnic communities. One reason for this tendency is that African leaders are so steeped in ethnic considerations that they cannot imagine any other mode of operation. This practice is also influenced by the ease with which African communities mobilize along ethnic and sub-ethnic lines. In other words, while in Western industrialized nations, corruption as well as conflict and political affiliation are based on cultural affinities and on divisions of economic class on what are called horizontal relations. In Africa, particularly in Nigeria, the weakness of genuine class distinctions makes appeal to ethnic ties, that is vertical relations, more potent. Another relevant factor is the way decisions have been made to constitute and reconstitute Nigerian federalism. These decisions have been made by the regime controlling the federal center, and imposed on the country. None of various configurations of Nigerian home federalism required inputs from the states and local governments. Again, because Nigeria has sought to emulate American political institutions, a comparison with the United States is helpful. Unlike the United States, experienced with federalism in the 18th century, when the states voted on the adoption of the federal structure, in Nigeria, the tenfold increase in the number of federal units from 3 to 30 between 1967 and 1991 was made by military governments of General Gowon, Obasanjo, and Babangida acting on their own authority. Thus, virtually the entire process of constituting and reconstituting these federal arrangements, including the addition of a third level of government consisting in 1991 of 589 local government units, has occurred under either colonial or military rule. The initial motivation to create additional subnational units in the federation was to bring government closer to the people, foster development, and accommodate the demands of minority ethnic groups for their own units. It was clear by 1991, however, that adding more states to the federation was an intrinsic part of a strategy of state corporatism designed to keep the many subnational units financially dependent on and beholden to the central government. Such practices were employed by the Babangida military regime to divide and control the Nigerian population rather to enhance popular participation. In sum, the Nigerian experience has promoted a distributive approach to federalism. The lofty claims for federalism as a way of promoting unity through diversity are lost amid the intense competition among local communities and elites for access to national patronage in the form of oil revenues, which are collected and then appropriated or redistributed by the federal administration. Clearly, the long periods of military administrations and their centralized power structures have hindered the emergence of genuine federalism in Nigeria. Thus, Nigeria has been described as a unitary system in federal disguise. As oil revenues came to dominate the nation's finances after the 1970s, the fact that the lion's share went to the federal government rather than to the state or local governments accentuated the centrally tendencies in Nigerian federalism. Federal character. Numerous attempts have been made to arrive at some form of elite accommodation to moderate some of the more divisive dimensions of cultural pluralism. For example, recruitment of local elements into the army shortly after independence followed a quota system. Through such a system, it was hoped the army would reflect the country's complex ethnic makeup more closely. A similar practice, reflecting what Nigerians now refer to as federal character, was introduced into the public service and formally codified in Section 14, subsection 3 of the 1979 Constitution. The composition of government of the Federation or any of its agencies and the conduct of its affairs shall be carried out in such manner as to reflect the federal character and the need to promote national unity and also to command national loyalty, therefore ensuring that there shall be no predominance of persons from a few states or from a few ethnic or other sectional groups in that government or any of its agencies. Because federal character is also perceived as a tool of ethnic management, disputes about its applications have tended to focus on ethnic representation rather than representation of a state interest. Although this principle was originally regarded as a positive Nigerian contribution to governance in a plural society, its application has tended to intensify rather than reduce intergroup rivalries and conflicts. In recent years, there have been calls for the use of merit over federal character in awarding public sector jobs. Despite the methods of its institution and reforms, ironically, the federal system has enjoyed wide support within Nigeria historically. However, the federal structure endures increasing strain. With the conclusion of the Civil War in 1970, it was assumed that the question of national unity has been finally settled. Thus, attempts to include clauses on the right to succeed into the constitutions of 1979 and 1989 were roundly rejected by the drafting committees. Other widely held beliefs although now questioned by some elements in society, is that Nigeria will continue to be a secular state as outlined in Section 10 of the 1979 Constitution, and will persist as a federation to accommodate the country's ethnic, cultural, and religious heterogeneity. Some Northerners have advocated turning Nigeria into an Islamic state, prompting fear among many Christians. To resolve these issues, some Nigerians have called for a national conference to review the basis of national unity and even to consider the restructuring of Nigeria into a loose confederation of autonomous states. Such calls have been ignored by the Abacha regime, which refused to permit any debate on the viability of a united Nigeria in the recent constitutional conference, thus maintaining the geographic status quo, at least for now. The executive. At independence, Nigeria inherited the British-type parliamentary system of government. The national government of the First Republic between 1960 and 1966 was headed by Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, a primus inter pares, that is the first amongst equals in his cabinet. A move towards a stronger executive type of personalized leadership followed the military coup of January 1966 and continued during the 13 subsequent years of military rule. It was therefore not surprising that by the inauguration of an elected administration in 1979 in the Second Republic, the parliamentary system had been dropped in favor of a presidential system based on the American model. In this system, the executive is chosen directly by the electorate rather than indirectly by the legislature. The rationale for this change was based on the experience of the First Republic, the instability and ultimate failure of that government, which was less a result of the parliamentary model per se than of underlying societal cleavages. This left a bitter legacy. In addition, there was a widespread belief that the popularly elected president, a truly national figure, could serve as a symbol of unity. Finally, the framers of the Second Republic Constitution believed that placing the election of the president in the hands of the electorate rather than parliament would mitigate the effects of the lack of party discipline in the selection of the executive. In rejecting British parliamentarism for American-style presidentialism, the framers of the 1979 Constitution of the Second Republic argued that the new arrangement would lead to a more focused executive authority and facilitate the effective use of that authority. According to them, the American model will also ensure, through the exercise of checks and balances and separation of powers, that no single arm of government will gain so much power as to put the liberties of citizens at risk. It was argued also that presidentialism would promote political integration, since it authorized the head of the executive branch to appoint individuals from outside the legislature to the cabinet. Powers were consolidated within the executive power, and the checks and balances and separation of powers central to the proper running of a presidential system in a constitutional government were gradually eliminated. Of course, as students of American constitutional history would readily recall, the reason given for checks and balances is to prevent the domination of any one branch of government over the others. The effective removal of legislative opposition has contributed to the unchallenged power of the executive branch in Nigeria. The Second Republic's experiment with presidentialism lasted for only 4 years before it was ended by the 1983 coup. Although there is a continued debate among political scientists over the relative merits of parliamentarism versus presidentialism, that coup did not indict the presidential model as such. Instead, the coup was justified by citing corrupt political practices, including massive vote rigging by the civilian regime of the elections in December 1983, as well as economic mismanagement. Once again, however, the reality of military rule further concentrated power in the hands of the chief executive, first head of state, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, until the 1985 Palace coup. His successor, General Babangida, although obviously unelected, assumed the title of president, the first Nigerian military ruler to do so, as if to confer some sort of popular legitimacy on his seizure of power. After ousting Shoneko in November 1993, Sani Abacha reverted to the title of head of state. The executive under military rule and future civilian governments. Under both civilian and military administrations, appointments to the highest and not so high offices of the state are made and restrained at the whim of the president, without the need for legislative approval for most senior appointments. Even with the tumultuous events in Nigeria since Babangida stepped aside in August 1993, the form and function of Nigerian politics remained basically the same. It is not surprising, therefore, that ethnic, religious, and regional constituencies pay close attention to the pattern of appointments to the executive branch and the higher echelons on the national bureaucracy. This scrutiny has intensified since 1983 under the Buhari and Babangida military regimes, both of which were headed by northern Muslim military officers. They have been criticized for inattention to southern and Christian interests in making appointments and for their policies in general. Furthermore, General Abacha, also a northerner and a Muslim, has attracted even greater criticism than his predecessors. Under the 1989 Constitution, the proposed Third Republic would have included an executive similar to the American model with the required checks and balances. The American presidential model is expected to be included once again in the recommendations of the Constitutional Conference of 1994 and 1995. However, it remains to be seen whether these provisions will be included in the revised document, and if they are, would they be respected through implementation. Nigeria's political history and recent experience suggests that the country will again experience the unchallenged neo-patrimonial rule of an executive president and his hand-picked cabinet, ineffectually checked by a weak legislature and judiciary, both vulnerable to executive and clientelist pressures. The military. As a result of its long years in power, the military has emerged as a central component of executive authority in Nigeria. As a consequence, the institution of military services has itself been weakened for, unlike professional, that is non-politicized militaries. Nigeria's military lacks discipline, a clear command structure, and unity of purpose. It has become evident since 1966, and it was increasingly so under Babangida's rule, that a distinction has developed between the military in government and the military barracks. A difference has emerged between military officers appointed to political posts and those who perform traditional military duties. Officers in the latter group have increasingly called for a withdrawal of the armed forces from politics and a return to military professionalism. Military coups against military-run governments have often resulted from this intramilitary tension. Several such attempts have not been successful, resulting in the execution of dismissal from office of those officers implicated or suspected of disloyalty. A final point to note is that the Nigerian military appears to have lost its political neutrality. In 1966, the Nigerian military was perceived as a temporary alternative to misrule by civilian politicians. Subsequently, the military as an institution was transformed from an instrument to assure national defense into a permanent alternative to political parties. 3 decades after the first military coup, Nigerians believe that the armed forces have compounded Nigeria's political and economic problems. Clearly, the Nigerian armed forces, in view of the number of years they have been in office, have primary responsibility for the country's failure to achieve economic growth, social peace, probity in government, and political development. Bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is related to and affects all aspects of Nigeria's governmental institutions. Although we refer to the Nigerian bureaucracy in the previous 2 sections, it is necessary to explain further how the Nigerian bureaucracy came to be bloated, inefficient, and corrupt. The colonial system relied greatly on an expanding bureaucracy to govern Nigeria. As structures of governance and society were increasingly Africanized, the bureaucracy became a means of rewarding individuals in the patrimonial system. Bureaucratic growth was then no longer determined by function and need. Increasingly, individuals were appointed on the basis of patronage, ethnic group, and regional origin rather than merit. Administration departments also became structures that the government could use to insulate and protect itself by installing civil servants who were loyal and beholden to the state. As successive military governments since 1967 increased the number of states, while also taking on grandiose public projects, the capabilities of the bureaucracy declined, while its size steadily increased. Conservative estimates of federal and state government personnel increased from a modest 72,000 at independence to well over 1 million by the mid-1980s. The largest component of the national bureaucracy in Nigeria is the state-owned enterprises, SOEs, or parastatals, which increased from 75 entities to 500 over the same period. Parastatals in Nigeria are corporate enterprises owned by the state and established to provide specific commercial and social welfare services. They can be regarded as situated between institutions that engage in traditional government operations such as customs or the postal service and those in the private sector that operate primarily for profit. In organizational terms, such parastatals are similar to private enterprises in that they have their own board of directors to which management is directly answerable. To this extent, they are autonomous of the government that established them. In reality, however, such autonomy is limited since their boards are appointed by and ultimately answerable to the government through the supervising government department in Nigeria called a ministry. In general, parastatals are established for the following reasons. First, they are created as public utilities to provide services that government departments cannot handle effectively. In such cases, private businesses cannot fully provide these services because the capital investment required is too great or national security implications may be involved, as in the case of ports, waterworks, telecommunications, defense industries, hydroelectric power, petroleum exploration and extraction. A second rationale for the establishment of parastatals is the need to accelerate economic development. This justification has been advanced for establishing parastatals in such large-scale industries as steel production, public transportation, petroleum, and certain areas of agriculture. Third, parastatals are intended to provide basic utilities and services such as water, electricity, agricultural support to citizens at a low cost. These costs are held below the level needed to generate a profit if the same services were provided by private firms. Finally, there is a nationalist dimension that relates to issues of sovereignty over sectors perceived to be sensitive. Parastatals are intended to provide services in economic areas that could fall under the control of foreign capital and expertise. The parastatal structure is seen as a way to reduce dependence on foreign multinational firms in such industries as air transportation, seaport management, steel and petroleum production, power generation, and mass communication. In Nigeria, parastatals such as Commodity Board and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation (NNPC) have served as major economic instruments of the interventionist states. They have been used to co-opt and hierarchically order business and societal interests within the state for the purpose of controlling both society and economy, a form of governance usually called state corporatism. Because they are not motivated by profits, they are protected by the state and are frequently managed by administrators whose jobs are based on their personal connections rather than on managerial ability. The track record of Nigerian parastatals is littered with inefficiency, cronyism, and various forms of corruption. Instead of providing economic benefits, most parastatal enterprises in Africa as a whole and in Nigeria specifically are a tremendous drain on the economy. Without concerted and genuine effort at privatization, therefore, the indications are that Nigerian parastatals will continue to fall far short of the original expectations that they would contribute to economic development and efficient provision of services. What is more likely is that parastatals will remain central to the politics of patronage and resource allocation conducted along class and ethnic lines. In this regard, their role as vehicles for venality and instruments of gross inefficiency will remain largely unchanged. Other institutions of governance and policy making, including the federal judiciary and subnational governments, incorporating state and local courts, operate within the context outlined above of a strong central government dominated by an all-powerful chief executive. The judiciary. At one time, the Nigerian judiciary enjoyed relative autonomy from the executive arm of government. Aggrieved individuals and organizations could take the government to court and expect a judgment based on the merits of their case. This situation changed as each successive military government demonstrated a profound disdain for judicial practices and eventually undermined not only the autonomy but also the very integrity of the judiciary as a third branch of government. The principal instrument used by the Babangida and Abacha regimes to achieve this outcome has been a spate of repressive decrees that contain ouster clauses disallowing judicial review. Such clauses are regularly inserted in government decrees, barring or ousting any consideration of their legality by the courts, as well as any actions taken by government officials under them. Other methods include intimidation by the security services, the creation of parallel special military tribunals that could dispense with various legal procedures and due process, and disrespect for courts of records. Through the executive power of appointment of judicial officers to the high bench, as well as executive control of funds required for the running of the judiciary, the government can manipulate and dominate the courts at all levels. Even in more routine civil and criminal actions, the courts are subject to political interference. In addition, what was once regarded as a highly competent judiciary has been undermined severely by declining standards of legal training as well as bribery. Deprived of adequate resources and the protection afforded the judiciary in Western societies, the judiciary has become more of an instrument of military regime than an independent branch of government. Any remaining doubts about this development were dispelled on July 22, 1993, when in what analysts labeled judicial terrorism, the Supreme Court endorsed a government position that literally placed all actions of the executive beyond the pale of judicial review. In a landmark judgment on a suit which sought judicial review of Babangida's decision to annul the June 12 election, the court ruled that it lacked jurisdiction, thereby bound to the government's lawyer argument that any decree of the military government is a law of the land and that such decrees cannot be challenged. The judiciary in Nigeria has effectively ceased to be the last hope of Nigerian citizens. The prolonged detention of Moshood Abiola after he declared himself president in June 1994, and the multiple changes in presiding judges hearing challenges to his detention, has further eroded public confidence in the judiciary. By the end of 1994, Abiola had received 4 rulings in his favor, declaring that he should be released on bail. The Abacha regime has steadfastly refused to comply and ultimately responded by revoking the writ of habeas corpus. State Security Decree No. 2 effectively prevents courts from urging the government to produce political detainees in court who wish to challenge their detention. It is hoped that some of the professionalism and dignity engendered by independence will revert to the judiciary, especially if provisions regarding its functions and authority in the 1989 Constitution are unchanged. That document calls for judicial autonomy, a true separation of power, judicial review, due process, and provisions for the appointment, tenure, and removal of judges. Even so, new budgetary arrangements will be needed to protect the institutional interests of the judiciary vis-à-vis the executive. Moreover, the executive will need to be encouraged to respect judicial autonomy as a vital component of democratic governance. Unfortunately, the experience of the judiciary during periods of civilian party politics, although not as devastating as during military rule, does not go down well for the restoration of an autonomous judiciary and respect for the rule of law in the near future. Subnational governments. The first or highest is the national government, which we also refer to as the central or federal government, and as in the case of the US, the federal system. There are also states and local levels of government. Like the national government, each of the 36 governments and 774 local governments in Nigeria has an executive branch and a legislative branch. The judicial system also resembles that of the United States, with a network of local and district courts as well as state-level courts. State and local judiciaries, the judiciaries at the state level, are subordinate to the Federal Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. Some of the states in the northern part of the country, with high Muslim populations, maintain a parallel court system based on the Islamic Sharia or the divine law. Similarly, some states in the middle belt and southern part of the country have subsidiary courts based on customary law. Each of these, in turn, maintains an appellate division. Otherwise, all courts of record in the country are based on the English common law tradition, and all courts are ultimately bound by decisions handed down by the Supreme Court. Because it has been a source of continued debate in Nigerian politics, the subject of Sharia deserves mention. For several years, some northern groups have participated in a movement to apply Sharia to all Nigeria, and some even advocated that it can be made the supreme law of the land. At present, Sharia's courts have jurisdiction only in civil proceedings and in questions of Islamic personal law. States and local governments are generally weak and dependent on federally controlled revenues. Most of them will be insolvent and unable to sustain themselves without substantial support from the central government because of the state's weak resource and tax base. In the same way that states depend on federal handouts, local governments have remained dependent on both states and federal government. This practice has continued despite reforms of local government system initiated by the Babangida regime in 1988, supposedly to strengthen that level of government. The weakness and dependence of all subnational governments lies in their inability to raise sufficient financial resources of their own through taxation and other means. These obstacles to subnational development persist despite constitutional and legal powers of the states and local governments to raise funds through taxes. There is a pronounced unwillingness among Nigerians, especially those in self-employment, trade, and other informal sector activities, to pay taxes and fees to a government with such a poor record of delivering basic services to the people. Moreover, it is often believed that most funds paid to the government at all levels will be misused or simply stolen. The result is a vicious cycle. Government is sapped of resources and legitimacy and cannot adequately serve the people. Communities in turn are compelled to resort to self-help measures to protect these operations and thus withdraw further from the reach of the states. In the civilian Second Republic, some conflict did develop between the federal and state governments, mostly over access to economic resources. About 19% of state incomes were received directly from the federal government, which includes a lump sum based on oil revenues plus a percentage of oil income based on population. With power in Nigeria concentrated at the political center, competition for scarce resources also takes place at the center. Many of the states have a predominant ethnic identification. Consequently, the struggle for national resources among states takes on an ethno-regional cast that has weakened Nigeria's federalism. Nigeria in international politics. In the modern world, a country's position in the world of states is determined largely by its power, which can be understood either in terms of economic resources or military capabilities, or both. Although Nigeria meets with these criteria within the West African region, on a global level, Nigeria has become increasingly marginalized. You should recognize, however, that Nigeria's position in the world of states is inextricably linked to its political economy and vice versa. In many respects, the course of Nigeria's political economy has been determined by its global position as a source first of slave and harvested natural products such as palm nuts, then of colonial extraction, and finally of oil exports. Resource-rich Nigeria has long been regarded as a potential political and economic giant of Africa, with its large population, extensive oil and natural gas reserves, and a broad agricultural and small industrial base, the country has a solid foundation for the achievement of self-sustaining growth. Yet, Nigeria is listed in the UNDP Human Development Report in 1995 as among the poorest 20% of the countries of the world, with a GNP per capita of just $330. Instead of independent growth, today, Nigeria depends on oil revenues, external loans, and aid, a victim of its leaders, bad policies, and poor management. Owing to underinvestment in and neglect of agriculture in the mid-1960s, Nigeria moved from self-sufficiency in the production of basic foodstuffs to heavy dependence on imports of those goods less than 20 years later. Nigeria's total reliance on oil as a source of foreign earnings has made it vulnerable to price fluctuations in the market. Drastic oil prices declines in the 1980s led to a severe shortage of funds and a need to borrow heavily from international lenders. In short, Nigerian politics is precarious, characterized by political and economic corruption, mismanagement, and social strife. What does this portend for the future? If Nigerian politics is truly at the crossroads, what lies ahead? Continued military authoritarianism or participatory democracy? Will the country continue its economic decline, or will it witness an economic recovery? Next, we identify some of the critical junctures beginning the pre-colonial period that helped shape the political and socio-economic landscape of modern Nigeria. An in-depth look at Nigeria's past should provide important clues to its future direction. Study session summary. In this study session, we focus on Nigeria's prolonged experience with the military rulers, which resulted in a policy process based on top-down directives rather than on consultation, a political debate, and legislation. Under Babangida, the concentration of power reached its highest level since independence. The period from 1985 until 1993 witnessed a concentration of policy-making, powers in his hands, and a corresponding weakening of the authority of the formal institutions of governance, namely the federal and the state legislatures. We also discussed the future of democracy, political stability, and economic renewal in other parts of Africa. Beyond the obvious demonstration effects, the economy of West African sub-region can be revitalized by resumed growth of the Nigerian economy. End of study session 8. Thank you for listening.